Grafton is a city in the Northern Rivers region in the Australian state of New South Wales. It is located on the Clarence River on a floodplain, approximately 620 kilometres or 385 miles by road, northeast of the state capital, Sydney. The closest major urban areas, Brisbane and the Gold Coast, are located across the border in southeast Queensland. On the banks of the Clarence River, Grafton is a historic town filled with glorious Victorian and Edwardian architecture. Each spring, the town turns a vibrant shade of purple as more than 1,700 jacarandas start to blossom. In October and November, the Grafton Jacaranda Festival is dedicated to the beautiful trees. The entire town is painted lilac, from specially curated art exhibits to nightly fireworks, parades, markets and entertainment. It was July 1977 and Narelle Cox had the world at her feet. Australia at this time was a wonderful place for young people. The popular 21-year-old was enjoying the kinds of freedoms young adults are afforded growing up in Australia, one of friends and parties, music and travel, work and plenty of play. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam's government from 1972 to 1975 transformed Australia in just 3 years with his progressive agenda which modernised Australian society. The future seemed brighter, colourful and more positive. Young people had their own culture but were assertive in politics and protests about issues of the day. In the 1970s, Australian women's magazines experienced a massive cultural shift, transitioning from traditional domestic and homemaking guides to progressive platforms, tackling the feminist movement, female sexuality and modern careers. This decade saw the rise of iconic mass-market publications for young women such as Dolly, Cleo and Cosmopolitan. Young women were encouraged to open bank accounts, travel and seek professional careers. Confidence could be gained through the right hair, beauty and fashion. Friendships and relationships and socialising were a priority. It was a decade which seemed that anything was possible for young people as new freedoms and opportunities emerged. The Australian music industry skyrocketed with local talent as good as anything from overseas. It was the golden age of pub rock, pop and the early punk and new wave scenes. Music acts like Cold Chisel, AC/DC, Sherbet, Skyhooks could be seen at pubs, festivals and on local music shows like Countdown. It was an exciting time and Narelle was a product of her times. She was independent, poised, had a desire to travel, but was also pursuing career goals. Narelle wanted to be a nurse and was waiting to hear back from the Darwin hospital she had applied to train at. 3 months went by without a word from the hospital before frustration set in. Sitting at home in Queen Street, Grafton, Narelle was restless, waiting to hear back from them. On a whim, she decided to relieve the boredom and pay her old school friend, Faye, a visit in Noosa, Queensland. By road, the distance is 465 kilometres and would take nearly 5 hours driving. But Narelle wasn't planning on driving. Perhaps she was in search of the last wave of 70s sentiment. Hitchhiking was much more common in the 1970s, but still amounted to roadside roulette as hikers relied on the kindness or cruelty of strangers driving north. How far she got is not known. But whatever dreams Narelle Mary Cox had as she hitchhiked from Grafton on that fateful day were never realised. She has been missing ever since. As wretched as timing would have it, Narelle's application papers arrived in the post the day after she left. Had she been at home, she would have stayed, planning on the next move in a pending career, but she wasn't and was never seen or heard from again. When Narelle left for Queensland, a note, the last piece of communication between her and her family, casually informed them of her plans. Karen, Her sister said, "We knew she was talking about it, but we didn't know she had left." On Wednesday, the 20th of July, 1977, Mum came home from work and found it. The note said, "Gone to Noosa to see Faye. Be back on Monday." Narelle had lived with Faye Brown in Noosa before. They often hitchhiked together. It was the 1970s and everyone was doing it, but Narelle's mother Beryl wasn't a fan. Karen said Mum told Narelle not to do it. She had just been given $200 for her 21st birthday because she didn't want a party. That was a lot of money back then, and Mum told her to spend it on a bus ticket. Nothing more was said after that. The Cox family didn't have a telephone. When Narelle failed to return to their Queen Street home on the Monday, Mrs. Cox went down to the post office the next day to send a telegram to Faye to find out what was going on. She received a response the next day, the dreaded words, "I have not seen or heard from Narelle," unleashing an agony her mother carried to her grave. That afternoon, Beryl and Karen went down to the Grafton police station to report Narelle missing, but instead of sharing their level of concern, the police response was confronting in its flippancy. Karen said they didn't seem to think it was that serious. She was 21, but they did tell us they would notify all the police stations between Grafton and Noosa to be on the lookout in case something happened. We assured them that Narelle would never disappear on purpose, that she was planning to be a nurse, that leaving a family without communicating was not the type of girl she was. They handed the police a photograph and left a description of what they believed she was wearing, her backpack and the guitar missing from her bedroom. The Cox family never had dealings with the police before, so they left the station believing that they had done all the right things to find Narelle. Mrs. Cox went back and forward to the police station, inquiring and leaving items to help in the search. Facial x-rays highlighting a broken nose sustained during Narelle's hockey playing days was a sobering piece of information for a mother to hand over. This, however, would ultimately go missing, along with the rest of Narelle's file in the decades that followed. After several weeks of no news, Beryl and Karen, the eldest of the siblings, got in their car and drove, a pilgrimage of helplessness that ended in devastating uncertainty. From Grafton to Brisbane, Karen said we'd called in to every nook and cranny along the way. We had photos and we were asking people whether they had seen her. When we got to Brisbane, we went to a police station. I can't remember which one, but they never knew anything about it. They had never heard of Narelle. They had never been notified. Karen recalls the devastation on her mother's face. The pair drove straight back to the Grafton police station, and we really went off at them, she said. It had now been 6 weeks since Narelle disappeared. After that revelation, the police did take a bit more notice, said Karen, putting an article in the paper with the information the family had originally supplied. The ad said, "Grafton police are anxious to locate Miss Narelle Mary Cox, 21, who has been missing from her home in Queen Street since the 20th of July. Beryl also took out an advertisement pleading for assistance and offering a reward for information leading to Narelle's return. What happened next is still conflicting to the sisters, more confusing information and frustrating dead-end leads in the disappearance of Narelle Cox. A man from the town of Lawrence, which is only 25 minutes away from Grafton, contacted police after seeing the paper. Karen said he'd been out fishing and thought he'd pulled up a girl's body on his anchor. The police divers were called up and they dragged the river. The man told them he got such a shock he dropped the anchor. The search went on for several days. Mrs. Cox spoke to the fisherman, but he told her he thought he saw blonde hair and the clothes didn't seem to match the description. Karen said, "We think he just said that to put her mind at ease. Whether there was ever an actual body, the family would never know. The police found nothing and the locals had conflicting things to say about the witness, who ranged from a drunk to a reliable fellow. Updates came and went, sporadically and traumatically. The truck driver who allegedly picked Narelle up from the South Grafton crossroads and gave her a lift to Brunswick Heads was never properly investigated because he wanted to remain anonymous. Narelle's family was left hanging without ever being given a name. Several people also reported seeing a young woman with a backpack and a guitar in the same South Grafton location. Another year passed, and then a knock at the door one afternoon at the family home. There was an announcement that Narelle had been found. "Oh my God, did you?" Karen recalled in disbelief at the time. "Where?" The two police officers told her Narelle had registered for unemployment in Sydney. Karen said to the police, "My mum is down there now. I'll call her." So I went to the exchange and Mum went straight around to the Epping Unemployment Office. Despite it being against the rules, under the circumstances, details of Narelle's registration were given to Mrs. Cox. However, unfortunately, the registration for unemployment had taken place the year before, when Narelle was living in Sydney. The family were obviously devastated to be given news that Narelle had been located living in Sydney and then to have their hopes dashed because the police didn't check the information correctly. It was beyond belief incredibly unprofessional and shocking. Karen said it was a terrible thing to do to her. There was no apology by the police, nothing. The whole approach by them when they turned up at home was really casual, as if they were saying, "See, we told you she was alive." For 6 years after Narelle's disappearance, Mrs. Cox put out a Christmas gift for her missing daughter. It was her way of making Narelle feel present and loved, to still be part of the family. Karen said Mum would often come around and say she had that terrible feeling in her chest again, that Narelle was somewhere and needed her. She wasn't a stupid person. She just got these feelings. For little sister Kathy, who watched her family unravel through a 15-year-old's eyes, it was a tremendous battle to cope each day, not knowing where Narelle was and if she would ever contact the family again. "There really wasn't any avenue for me to take at the time," Kathy said. "No counselling or help. I was a lot younger than my sisters, and they were busy helping Mum. The only thing I did was write myself a little note. Mum ended up finding it. It was just to get my feelings on the page, and I hid it in my room and didn't show it to anyone. That's all I did." Kathy said even years and years after Narelle was gone, she still found herself checking every hitchhiker she passed. "Even though you know it's not rational thinking, I always look to see." Kathy said her strongest memory of Narelle was of a sophisticated woman, one she looked up to. She was very much a lady and very confident in herself, which I really admired because I wasn't. She had this air about her. I thought she was brave. She finished school, went to college, went to Sydney, went to Noosa. She was getting out there and living her life. Narelle's mother Beryl died in 1983 and her husband Bill died a decade after that. Narelle's disappearance killed their mother, Narelle's sisters believed. Beryl died 6 years after her daughter vanished, and their father never spoke her name again. Years passed and the Cox family siblings tried to move on with their lives. In 1994, a case being talked about in the media struck a chord with Karen. Ivan Milat was being investigated by Task Force Air, and the circumstances of Narelle's disappearance sounded very similar. So Karen called them. Karen said they listened to what I had to say and took down my details, but I didn't expect to hear back from them. But 10 minutes later, they called me back. They did a check on the dates and didn't think it was him, as he was signed in to work at a particular place and time, and they left it at that. Serial killer Ivan Milat was apt at picking up people on lonely stretches of road. Detectives believe Milat was in the area at the time. However, no evidence has been found linking Milat to Narelle. Ivan Milat was serving 7 consecutive life sentences for the infamous backpacker murders. He had abducted, robbed and murdered 7 young travellers in the Belanglo State Forest, New South Wales, between 1989 and 1992. Narelle's best friend, Sue Cantle, believed they shouldn't have ruled Malat out so quickly because he used to get people to sign in for him at different times. He had also been in Grafton jail and released from there, so he was familiar with the area, she said. If the truck driver dropped Narelle in Brunswick Heads area like he said he did, then that put her right in the hotspot of where people were going missing. Malat was working on the roadworks at northern New South Wales at the time, but no one knew who he was back then. It was dangerous to go hitchhiking at that time. A lot of girls went missing. Karen admitted it was a different time when it came to the way police handled missing persons. When Narelle's investigation was reopened by the coroner in 2005 to sign off on a backlog of cold cases, the response from the modern establishment was a far cry from what the family had experienced back then. They were shocked about how it was handled and frustrated by the lack of follow-ups, which wasn't helped by the absence of the original file. The media were also not helpful at that time. Apart from the police request for information, there was limited coverage about Narelle in the Daily Examiner. Even A Current Affair weren't interested, Sue Cantle said. There seemed to be a smorgasbord of predators about during that period, and the states didn't communicate with each other back then. It was only in 2005, when they asked for a DNA sample during the coroner's reinvestigation from Karen and her younger brother Bill Jr., that the states really started to interact. After a final statement was provided by Karen in 2005, the coroner signed off any further investigations into the disappearance of Narelle Cox. Dead or alive, the case was closed. Narelle had a passion for horse riding and playing sport, playing the music she loved, like the Doors, the Stones and Boz Scaggs. For young people in the 1970s, it was a time of freedom and dreaming big, seeing those dreams come true and living a life different to their parents. The backdrop of the hedonistic 70s had given Narelle the confidence to fly high and seek adventure. Unfortunately, freedom came at a severe cost. For her short time on Earth, Narelle had achieved a lot. But until new evidence surfaces, the disappearance of Narelle Cox remains filed away as a cold case. Thank you for watching.